Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We are talking innovation today. We have a strong panel of experts in the field today, and I'm pleased to see so many from all around, across borders, are joining right now as I'm talking. On behalf of the Finnish British Chamber of Commerce and the Danish-UK Association, really pleased to have you all here today. A few house rules, if I may. You can already now ask questions. Use the question box, and I will curate them together with Nils Elmark, the moderator, that I'll introduce in a few moments. The chat, as you can see, I'm really pleased to see all of you are already telling where you're listening in from today, and feel free to comment. And as you notice already as well, the speakers have commented back, so make sure you use that. If you have anything, you can comment in there, but the questions, use that in the question box. You'll also see that you have a handout available for download, the delegate list, and that is for all the ones who have registered until this morning, and it gives you an idea who are all listening in today, which sometimes can be a bit difficult to get that feel when we sit in these electronic virtual webinar rooms. The platform we're using today is called 23. It's a Danish platform developed over the last year or so innovation in its own right. And I'm pleased to say that we have been given access to this platform by one of our members of the Danish-UK Association, Novelty, a digital agency. So please do look them up if you may find a use for them as well. And finally, let me say this session will be recorded, and it will be shared with all of you a few hours after this webinar. So it will arrive into your inbox, your email inbox. And if you for some reason did not get that email, it may end up in your spam filter, or some of you have strong firewalls, then just use the link that you used right now and you'll get into the recording in a couple of hours' time. So with that, let us kick off, and I'll take the liberty to now introduce you to our moderator of today. I'm pleased to say we have Nils Elmark joining us for this session. Nils is the founder and of a consultancy called Inception, and has been advising international businesses for a couple of decades, I dare say, conducting development in financial institutions. He teaches strategy and future studies at the Danish Business Institute, has previously written 3 books about technology, business innovation, and creative strategic communications. He is also a columnist at the CEO World magazine, and most recently author also of The New Local Economy, published in 2019. So with that, can I ask you, Nils, to take it from here and run the webinar? Welcome, Nils.
Okay. Thank you, Gunnar. I'll do my best to curate the day and lead you through a discussion about innovation. And as Gunnar said, I'm a futurist. I'm not trying to predict the future, but I'm trying to help businesses get better dreams to get more out of their future than they're doing today. I'll try and create a short scenario about the future and see how we can innovate in this future. We may say that I'll help the two the two speakers today to tell more about the future, give a portrait of how do we innovate in the future. What I believe that we are in a new age of modernism, that we will change everything. Basically, we are moving from one game board with old rules and old technologies, and trying to move from there to a modern game board with new rules and new technologies. It's difficult, and at the same time, we're in the middle of a transition. We're in the middle of the crisis. And we can see that what we thought about this crisis has told us that we are on the wrong path. We had to change something. We can see that the supply chain has been stretched too far. We see we can't get stuff that we need because it's being manufactured too far away from home. We've also seen that we've forgotten about people. We talked a lot about economy, and economy has been more important than people, and it's changing now. We can see that people matter. All people matter at the moment. We care more about the community. So I see two challenges at the moment that we have to overcome. One is that we have to get rid of the past. We have legacy systems, we have legacy thinking, and we had to get rid of that. We have to put the past behind and get into the future. The challenge here is how do we move into a future which looks chaotic at the moment? How can we do that when nothing is there? And that's a topic today. And I've tried to divide the discussion into 3 bullet points. One is the dreams, the goals. What is it that we really want? If we can't look into the future and see what's going to happen, at least we can say, this is what we want from the future. And how do we do that? The second is, how do we organize the process? How do we organize innovation in this volatile future, chaotic future? And the third thing is, how do we communicate about the future? How can we communicate in a way that people will enjoy the future, that people will be attracted to the future and understand the innovation that we're trying to do in our businesses? And for that topic, we have Kevin and Tass. And when I read their bios and resumes, I was overwhelmed. I mean, those two people are a powerhouse of innovation and inspiration. And they know so much about what's happening in the world. They are innovators from the front. They've been at the front line of innovation and business communications over the last 20 years. So I'll try and just open their microphones, because I don't doubt that they will create wonders when they start to talk. So and I think let's start with Kevin and hear him a presentation about himself, and also ideas that he wants to get across here at the beginning.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed. As usual, I didn't recognize myself from the eulogy that you gave me there, but I will try and pass on a few ideas about innovation. These I'll do in rapid order. They're really just fast provocations, and a lot of them come from a short book called The Smart Thinking Book, which has a chapter on it. So I will rush along with these in short order, and then we'll get some views and discussion and hear from Taz as well, I'm sure. So one of the questions that I often get asked, and in fact I've asked it of myself, is what is innovation? Now, it seems like a bit of a banal question, but funnily enough, when you ask people this, half the time they actually can't answer it properly. Now, I was delighted a few years back to discover an extraordinary study that had been conducted by some very brainy business professors with brilliantly named Uzi and Jones. And what they wanted to know was, of all the stuff that is announced in the world as being apparently breakthrough and rather innovative and brilliant and groundbreaking and all these macho adjectives, how much of it is actually original? And they invented this extraordinary thing, which I barely understand the science behind, but essentially it was an algorithm which they dropped into the World Wide Web, and it analyzed 17.9 million papers, scientific papers that apparently claimed some sort of ingenious breakthrough. And they found out that over 90% of all those breakthrough papers contained material that had already been mentioned somewhere else before. So in other words, my definition of innovation is that it's 90% old stuff with a 10% modern twist. Okay, and this is something that essentially musicians and film writers and so forth have known for years. Genius steals. It's not where you get it from, it's where you take it to. So that is my definition of innovation for what it's worth. So if we move on to the next slide, here are some provocations to get you thinking about what innovation could be. So starting top left, be relentlessly curious. Now, this is what I call being a mental magpie. And magpies collect stuff all the time, but they don't necessarily know why. They just put it in a pile and think, well, that'll be useful one day. And of course, they don't know what it is yet. And interestingly, being relentlessly curious is not something that you can do particularly well if you're sitting at your desk all day with your blinkers on. So you need to be mentally looking outward for interesting stimuli, which you can then connect to briefs and challenges as they come in. The next point, close or far away. I often find that people think that innovation is some massive radical departure from the item in hand, but actually it isn't. It's usually just a short step just in the nearest simple direction, and it's something that a rather intelligent bloke called Stuart Kaufman calls the adjacent possible. It's the nearest simple thing that you can do that makes a difference. So think about that. It should be closer rather than further away. The next point, break with the past. This echoes, in fact, what Nils was saying in his introduction, where he actually used the phrase, get rid of the past. And in this, break with the past is essentially a way of thinking which prevents you and all your colleagues and anyone else who's in the conversation from constantly going on about what's gone on before, because it just isn't interesting and it's not relevant. What we're interested in is some form of forward motion. There's also a lovely book by Max McEwen called #Now. There's no point in talking about the past because now is where it all happens in the present. So the interesting point about that for me is if you've got clients, colleagues, bosses, anybody who are essentially just boring people talking about the old days, well, they need to work out a way to unknow something so that they can free their minds and think in a more interesting way. Final one on this chart, progress, not perfection. Nothing's ever perfect, so don't bother. Try for something that's broadly working, give it a twist, try it again, keep moving, and you're aiming for progress, not perfection. You know what I mean, because anyone who is a perfectionist doesn't even like it because they can't define it and they don't even know when they've got the final thing done because nothing ever is perfect. So progress, not perfection. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. Now, Nils was talking about dreams and goals, and to me that's very similar to planning, as in what is your plan? Now, it was fascinating, but if you go back 30, 40, 50 years in business, people would frequently say to you, what's your 10-year plan? And of course, as soon as the internet came along, this became a ridiculous question. So it would be, what's your 5-year plan? Your 4, your 3, your 2, your 1. And if you talk to most young business people these days, they'll say, well, there's no point planning really, because we don't even know what's going to happen next month. Now, the interesting thing about that is that people can be deceived by plans and spend inordinate amounts of time doing them. So, for example, your average company may well spend between August and December drawing up the plan for next year. And it's a massive dance between departments of exchanging figures and so forth. But does it get them anywhere? Not necessarily, because as Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So as soon as something new happens, and of course recent events have demonstrated this in an extraordinary way, then the plan, close quotes, goes out the window. So we've got to be flexible enough to have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D and use iterative work to arrive somewhere better rather than just sticking to, quotes, the plan. Moving on top right, there's a lovely old academic joke which says, yes, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And the interesting thing about planning and innovation and all these commercial areas is that it's easy to sit around just talking. And you can talk as long as you like, but it may not get you anywhere. And so this chap, Richard Pascal, has a wonderful way of phrasing this, which is saying, we don't think our way into a new way of acting. We act ourselves into a new way of thinking. In other words, don't spend too much time talking. Get on with something which shows what the new possibility could be. And that links to the next point, bottom left, which is prototyping as shorthand. Now, this is something that engineers have known for decades. You have to get a working thing up and running to prove or disprove whether it's going to work and be a better thing. Now, a lot of people struggle with this because they come up with conceptual ideas in brainstorms, and then everything's theoretical and vague, but no one's actually tried to work out, is this really going to work? And particularly for service industries, there's a very nice thing called body storming. And this is where you actually act out what the new service could be like in a preparatory way, body storming rather than brainstorming. There's also a lovely new thing which I read about a couple of weeks ago, which is called prototyping, preto rather than proto. And this apparently was to try and encourage really slow moving companies to, for heaven's sake, get on and do a prototype because they're being so slow. So bringing things forward and prototyping might be useful for slower moving cultures. In a related point about speed, the quote bottom left, really nice quote from Jeremy Clarkson. He said, speed doesn't kill you. Becoming stationary really fast, that's what gets you. Okay, and the metaphor, if you like, for innovation projects is that it's essential to have momentum. There's always a motivational dip. Everyone's really excited initially, and then all the steam comes out of the project. And if you don't get it done pretty fast, it's unlikely to arrive at all. So moving on to my final slide with 4 more provocations. There's a basic discipline which we've all known from the creative industries for years, which I call kill more good ideas. We can all have lots of good ideas, but are they really great? And how many of them have you got? And if you've got a bunch of quite good, but not brilliant ideas, you've got to have the courage and the discipline to throw them all away in the interests of coming up with something that's really, really good. Quite an opposite point to this is on the right, turn ors into ands. And that essentially means that in many businesses, people say, well, we could do this, or we could do that. But in fact, it's not always a binary choice. And there are markets and occasions where it's actually really helpful to say, well, we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do that, and we could do that. And so proliferation of many small ideas could be a really good way to get innovation thoroughly underway. Finally, then, 2 points linked. One is novelty overload. Beware of this. There was a lovely quote from Sam Goldwyn, who was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the American film company. He said, I had a monumental idea this morning, but I didn't like it. And there's an example of someone who can self-edit. And so be careful, because everybody loves new, shiny stuff more than they do the existing stuff, but you may subject you or your company or department to novelty overload and end up with so many projects going on, all started, that you can't see the wood for the trees and you end up not getting anywhere at all. And so my final point there is linked to that, and that is, don't forget that quitting can be winning. If something is not working, kill it, end it, because then you can free up resource to get on with something better. So there we go. Those are my thoughts and provocations on innovation.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Before we go on to Tess, we have a short poll that we want you to answer. So if Connor can...
I'm going to start the poll now. It's going to be visible in the top right corner and on your screen right now. So maybe, Nils, you want to take us through the poll?
Yes. So if we look at the situation right now, what makes innovation difficult? Is it because you can answer several of these, you can click off several of these answers. Is it because we lack bright visions, is it because the future is chaotic, so we can't see anything? Or is it because we really don't want to change? We're happy with the things as they are. Or maybe we want to change, but management, they won't let us. And maybe we have more urgent problems to deal with. I mean, at the moment, when you talk about innovation, normally a lot of managers and leaders say, sorry, we have so much at our plate at the moment, so we have little time for dealing with innovation. And then finally, it's not difficult at all. We can easily innovate.
I'm going to leave the poll open, taken off the screen, but it's still going to be visible in the top right corner on most of your computers, or if and you can answer it for the next couple of minutes till I close it. And Nils, you can continue.
Thank you. And then I'll pass the microphone on to Tas and hear his introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone, from my loft room. Interestingly, I've realized that when you do panels, or even if you just like watch interviews on television, there are sort of two options. There's the one where they have to have scrupulously balanced panels. So you get somebody who argues about, I won't say Brexit, I don't know, a particular issue, and we have somebody in favour and we have somebody against. And that's like the BBC, a point of view, which is you must always ensure balance. Or you have a panel where actually there's a lot of overlap and perhaps you look at sort of different issues. And I think probably today's the second, because Kevin and I share certain sort of issues of background. We worked in agencies and clients in strategy and planning. So there are an awful lot of things that he said that I would absolutely violently agree with. So what I want to do is put up some points which to some extent perhaps reflect what Kevin said, but also just to perhaps take you into some different directions rather than just me obviously just repeating what he said. What I really want to do is talk to one of the guests who's from Essex, and we can talk about Southend United in the 1970s and 80s. Probably that'll have to be another day, Graham. So if we can put my charts up, Gunnar, and I'll just take you through some of the points that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to talk a bit about really my middle book, The Inspiratorium, which is about insight and inspiration. And I want to talk about really sort of innovation from the point of view of insight. Because for me, one of the things that we absolutely must have, well, I think my charts are flashing, I don't know if that's a worry. We must have insight. Insight is about seeing things that other people don't see. It's about looking at what's already there, if you like, Kevin's point about the 90%, but then actually seeing it in a new way, seeing it in a new light, reframing it, if you like. So I want to talk a bit about innovation from that point of view, and I want to talk about the other eye in how we actually come up with innovation and insight. So next slide, please, Gunnar. So just briefly, those are my three books. I've only got three. I think Kevin's actually got a dedicated room in the British Library for all of his. So my first one is about storytelling. So again, what I spend a lot of time talking about is training companies. I hope everyone else is not flashing. Maybe it's just my bandwidth. I talk about how we can use storytelling techniques to be more effective persuaders, more influential, etc. The second book, as I say, is about insight and inspiration, which is what I'm going to talk about really this afternoon. And the new one, which is now an ebook, is a collection of quotes and sayings and expressions. And again, I'm perhaps going to mention one or two things that come from that as a way of getting us to see and think and act differently, which is the precursor for any form of innovation. So I think I've got a couple of slides now that I just want to take you through in terms of my approach to insight and innovation. But before I do, we've had a few quotes from Kevin. This is one of my favorite quotes. An American baseball coach, very famous for his witticisms and aperçus, Yogi Berra. He said, it's hard making predictions, especially about the future. And I think one of the things that I want to just bring in now is I talk an awful lot about behavioral economics, the idea that human beings are far more influenced in their decision-making and their choice by emotional and unconscious and contextual factors than we like to admit. We like to think everything is rational. We do it in a very considered, logical, sequential manner. Most of the time, that's not the case. And one of the other things that falls out of the behavioral economics philosophy is the fact that by and large, our system one, our unconscious, where all the emotions live, where all our instincts live, is pretty much concentrated and focused on one thing alone, which is how do we survive now? It's about immediacy, it's about the here and now. System two, which is the slightly more rational aspect or process of the brain, is a little bit more forward thinking, but even so, it's not very good. So all you have to do is look at some of the black swans, as Nassim Taleb calls them, over the last 10 or 15 years, things that really did come out of the blue. The fact that the internet wasn't just some sort of weird engineering experiment. The fact that 2008's crash, again, took most people by surprise. My favorite example of the black swan, which is really unexpected, and again, this is relevant for us in the writing and teaching world, is a book called 50 Shades of Grey, which I'm sure most of you watching have never heard of. E.L. James started off by writing fan fiction for Twilight. And a few people said to her, all this good stuff, it's a bit racy, but you should turn it into a novel. So she took out all the stuff that was to do with Twilight and turned it into 50 Shades of Grey. Every major publisher turned around to her and said, this is horrible, this is erotic, it's disgusting, we can't publish it, no one will buy it. Look what happened after that. So I'm slightly on the side of saying, actually, we have to be very careful about making predictions. As Kevin said, the future is already here. I think William Gibson, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I'm very, very concerned about making too many big plans and dreams and hopes. And again, I think perhaps sort of dovetailing with what Kevin said, let's be careful about making things too explicit about what we think the future may hold, especially in the current circumstances. So let me just take you through my 2 slides of provocations. So the first one, Gunnar, if we can have the next slide, thank you. I call it incitement. It's a process for creating insight within companies. And just very broadly, I've just outlined sort of 5 points. Behavioral economics reminds us that we have 6, pretty much 6, sometimes 7, universal human emotions, which we all respond to and which drive our desire and our instinct to survive and thrive. Since you asked me, it's happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. And one of the most key of those emotions is surprise. And surprise has a very sound evolutionary reason. It's there to make sure that if something important comes to our attention that might affect our survival or our chances of reproduction or reproductive success, that bit of information gets through. I don't think we give enough attention to surprise. I think too much innovation, as I'll come on to later, it's about taking what we already have and building on it. And maybe this is where I'm deliberately trying to distance myself a little bit from what Kevin's saying. I'm very interested in getting that emotion of surprise. Isaac Asimov, the famous fiction writer, scientist, once said, the thing that scientists say isn't eureka, it's that's funny. And I think for me, innovation is all about creating that sense of surprise, that sense of that's funny. The feeling that actually this is slightly unusual, slightly unexpected, and then you feel it almost, as I say, at a visceral emotional level. If anyone wants to hear any more of this, I'm a lapsed classicist, so I'm contractually obliged to talk about some Latin words and some etymology. I'm a great believer in failure and mistakes. So the Latin word errare, from which we get the word error. Let's be careful about error, because error isn't necessarily something we punish. Error comes from the Latin word errare, and errare in Latin meant to wander. So we still have an echo of that in the English word erratic. If you're driving erratically, you're wandering all over the road. Sometimes we talk about aberrant behavior. So I think it's okay to wander. If we're wrong sometimes, that's okay, but what we're doing is wandering. I think it was Tolkien who said, not everyone who wanders is lost. There's a chapter in the second book about being an outsider. Some of the greatest insights and innovations, some of the greatest creativity comes from people who are outsiders. Again, this reflects, I think, some of the things that Kevin was saying. I always like to think when I was working with clients as a planner, it's important for us to have one foot inside the business so we can understand, we can have the conversations, we know the business, but to make sure we have one foot outside that world. It's important that we are not just completely focused and obsessed with fast food or yogurt or cars. because it's impossible to come up with anything breakthrough if you do. My fourth point on the bottom left is what are called in the trade, and if you like this acronym, please use it. They're called external serendipitous influences. There you go. ESIs are actually effectively doing something else that creates something new in your system one, which may not work now, which may not flash a bulb now, but in 3 weeks, 3 months, or however long, action will be made. So make sure that you're on the lookout for ESIs. Reading a book. Clearly, there are several people here who have some books to sell. Going to a film, going to an art gallery, but do something surprising and unexpected. And the other I word, we talk an awful lot about innovation and insight. A man called Graham Wallace wrote a book, I think in 1926, and he was the first one to outline a process for creativity and innovation. And he said that first I is immersion. You immerse yourself in your market, in your world. The third step, and yes, I know I've missed one out, the third step is illumination. It's the light bulb, it's the eureka, it's the aha. If there's time, I'll tell you the story about eureka. Actually, I probably won't tell you the story about Archimedes in the bath. But the second I is the I that we forget. The I that he talked about in 1926 is called incubation. And what he said is that you will never get to illumination just by immersion, just by throwing yourself into understanding every single thing you can about low-fat yogurt. You need to have something incubating in your brain, what we call now ESIs, other influences, other connections. And then your brain is more likely to come up with something unexpected. So I've got my last slide now, which I think is just some overall points really which come out of that. Both Kevin and I seem to have landed on the word provocations a lot. Again, this pretty much does reflect some of the points Kevin made. I call it surfacing assumptions. Whatever assumptions you have about your market, or particularly about your consumer, who they are, what they want, what they need, make sure you have some sort of workshop, some sort of way of actually surfacing them, putting them out, bringing them to the surface with yourself, with your team, with your client, whoever it might be. And then go through the process of examining those assumptions, saying how many of them really are valid, how many of them really are rock solid and must never be sacrificed, rather than how many can we actually tweak or throw out completely. One of the greatest ways that ad agencies worked at coming up with new ideas was to look at conventions within a market. So if I were to ask you now, I might try and do this on the chat. If I ask you quickly, give me 2 or 3 ways of describing a typical car ad. What do you see, or who do you see in a typical car ad? By the way, when I ask a question, it also means I need some tea. So if anyone wants to try on the chat, what do you tend to see in the typical classic car ad? Has no one seen a car ad, or am I just not seeing it? Scenery, yeah. Where's it shot from? What type of scenery? Where? Mountains, exactly. Most car ads are man, car, scenery, landscape, space, freedom, mountains. Exactly. Everyone says the same thing whenever I do this in a workshop. And it's always shot from above. And it's always men. You're absolutely right. If there's a woman in there, she's a passenger or she's a sort of luxury assistant. You're absolutely right. Why does that happen? Because the assumption is we need to show the car looking great. What's a great way of making a car looking great? Shoot it from above in Tuscany, right? But then everyone does that and all car ads look the same. Like mobile phone ads. Don't ask me why there's always balloons in there. Secondly, a bit of Darwin for you, ladies and gentlemen. Darwin talked about the evolutionary, the fossil record. And he said an awful lot of evolutionary history is incrementalism. It's just basically tiny changes in species or in groups of species or in environments. But he also used the word that said, if you look at the fossil record, there are times where suddenly a whole new branch will emerge and a whole branch will die. Something drastic changes, not just when the dinosaurs were wiped out. And the word he used was another Latin word, saltation. It means to jump. Again, what I'm interested in, again, just trying to maybe create a bit of distance with Kevin, is I'm interested in saltation. So whether that's 90% of what went before, I'm interested in things that are really radically different and disruptive. And the story I often tell, I used to work many years ago on Cadbury, the confectionery makers, in what I call the pre-guerrilla era, i.e. when they were rubbish. And we always used to wonder what the people who made Kit Kat would do, because we assumed that they'd come in on a Monday morning and they would say, okay, this week, what flavor should we put in a Kit Kat? Mint. And then they do that and then just go home for the rest of the week and watch telly. And the next week they come back and say, what flavor should we put in a Kit Kat? Orange. And that would be it. And we always thought that was quite an easy job. Now that's incrementalism. My point is I'm interested in innovation that is about saltation, about making big, unexpected leaps. The third one, and I've deliberately done this to be provocative, because those of us who are working behavioral economics and planning and research, we've always been told, you know, the customer is king, the consumer is king. We have to listen to the consumer, do lots of research. You know what? Maybe not. Maybe not. There's all sorts of arguments, for example, whether Steve Jobs did actually say it's not our job to listen to the consumer. But he's right, because again, a lot of times when you listen to the consumer, you ask them the same questions, you get the same answers, you end up having the same solutions, everything looks homogeneous. So I think, I wouldn't say never do market research, but just be careful that you don't create a consumer-based echo chamber. And my fourth point is I'm interested in bottom-up innovation as much as top-down, not just command and control, but stuff that again is little and small and seeps out. Little ideas that sometimes do come from unexpected corners, from unexpected things that maybe consumers do say in groups that you haven't asked them about. And my last point is really about collisions and combinations and connections. Because again, looking at the brain, looking at neuroscience and System 1, the brain creates innovation by making new connections. I often say my definition of insight, information is to be collected, insight is to be connected. So again, what we need to do is feed our System 1 and make sure that it creates new ideas, new connections, new collisions, as a lot of scientists will call them. And that might give us some truly disruptive innovation. And I think that's the last slide. I think there's another slide, but it might just be a holding slide. Yeah, there we go. So I think that's enough from me. Back to you, Nils.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to take you up on the word to innovate. We use it all the time. And every time we talk about, I want to innovate, we look at what we have. We don't talk about to create, we talk about to innovate. And it's kind of holding us back. The moment we talk about creation, the space in front of us opens. So if we look at Steve Jobs, and when he created the iPhone, he didn't innovate the mobile. He created a whole new platform for communications. So what are your take on that? Should we talk more about to create and less about to innovate? Because we are moving from the old game board to the new one. Let's hear your take on it, Kevin, please.
Yeah, well, we always used to say in advertising that creative people had the hardest job, because every morning they come in and there's a blank piece of paper in front of them, and it's one of the most scary things that anybody can ever see. It's just completely blank. Now, that is enough to put terror into most people. But I think to get this in perspective commercially, let's just think about the difference between commercial reality and blinding flashes of light. And what I mean by that is that for most of us humble people, 99% of the time, we are trying to take an existing thing and rethink it a bit and make it better. But it's extremely unlikely that we are doing a Thomas Edison and inventing the world's first ever light bulb. Occasionally that happens. You've probably heard the old story that Steve Jobs was incredibly possessive about his whiteboard. He would not allow anybody whatsoever to write on his whiteboard other than himself, almost childish. But that's because he wanted to be the sole person to create that stuff. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question, but I think for most humble practitioners, some helpful steps towards something better is the most likely thing, rather than a blinding flash from a blank piece of paper.
Yeah, I agree with that, except if only just to, as I say, create a bit of diversity. I think creativity is a lot of what I've been talking about, because innovation just means new, just means doing something new. I think creativity is all about looking for something that hasn't been done, or something that's been done in a different way. And as Kevin said, and it's clear if you look at the history of literature, you know, most literature, most creative arts is about inheriting myths. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm a classicist. If you look at the way that some of those classical myths are still being talked about now, it's amazing how much sort of life and vitality they have. So I think you're right. And I think the quote which allegedly, you know, Henry Ford said about asking people, you know, if you'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So again, I'm sort of just, if only just to create a bit of space, I understand exactly the need for sort of small steps and giving people a process, but I also want to sort of liberate people who are in the innovation field to give them permission to be a little bit more creative, to search for those sparks. As Kevin said, yes, a lot of those sparks will, you know, be extinguished, they'll lead nowhere. But I think for me, when I've seen sort of innovation workshops, sometimes for me, it feels that they can feel a bit pedestrian. So I'm all for sort of giving creativity its, you know, its due.
Thank you. You are both storytellers, and what I believe is driving innovation and creation is a narrative. Behind me, I have Tintin, and as a boy, when I read Tintin, he was on the moon 12 years before Armstrong. And I believe that you could go to the moon. It was not something impossible, because it was in the narrative. It could be, I could talk about it. And we used to have a narrative in Europe. We knew where we were going. UK used to have a narrative. A lot of companies used to have a narrative about what they wanted to do. It seems to me at the moment that they lack this narrative. They don't talk about where they want to go. And companies and people tend to go in the direction they're talking. So what do you think about it?
So it's a complicated time at the moment, and you could say that everybody's lost their mojo, and that could be from the individual all the way up to a government. Everyone in a state of panic. And I think that you said in your poll, or there was an option in the poll, which says it's all too chaotic. But actually, given that we can't predict the future, we don't actually know that it is going to be chaotic. So it actually might be perfectly fine in certain regards. But I think if people have, let's say an entire country has lost its narrative, let's say the EU or something like that, then it may fall more to the individual to say, well, this is what I would like to strive to do, to take it down to a slightly more personal level. And then you can decide what you want to do with your day, your week, your life. And I think that might be the way it goes. But I'm guessing, because I don't know.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think in terms of what narratives, I'm talking about retail this week or next week. And clearly the retail world needs a sort of strong narrative to bring people back. And I think a lot of that narrative is actually what we've forgotten, really, or lost over the last few months, that sense of sort of communal joy and release and freedom. It's not just about spending money. It's all sorts of other factors. So I think one of the interesting narratives that emerged, certainly in the UK, was the idea of the social norm that was created by the government at the beginning of our lockdown. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Which from a behavioral economics point of view was quite interesting, because it did use the sort of the idea that we need to create and reinforce a social norm which everyone can actually obey and play into, and we'll find a way of like punishing defectors. So I'd like to think that there might be some emerging narratives that we can use once this sort of pandemic comes out, sort of peters out or finishes. I'm also not sure as well whether in 6 months or a year, things will be any more chaotic than they were before. I mean, there have been so many international, local, political, social issues going on. Also, remember what happened to Greta Thunberg, for example. So I think a lot of those things will probably return to, like, you know, the new normal. And I think it would be nice, actually, if as countries, as cultures, as companies, and as individuals, we can perhaps think a little bit more about the sort of stories, the sort of heroes we want to be in our stories. And it may not be as big and idealistic as that. And a lot of it might be, for example, just about empathy. I mean, I'd like to think that one of the things that's come out in some ways in some countries over the last few months is just this sense of sort of greater connectedness and empathy. So for me, a narrative that had emotion and empathy more at its heart might not be a bad place to start.
Thank you. Gunnar, can we see the poll that we did? How far have we come?
Yes, we can. This is the poll is now closed, and this is the result.
Okay. So yeah, Taz and Kevin, what do you think about it?
Well, first of all, I'm reassured that people say it's not difficult. And I take chastisement from Taz about my small incremental steps. I was trying to emote with the average everyday executive rather than the Einsteins of this world. But the good news from this poll is that 40% of the audience are saying, actually, it's not blindingly difficult. And this is a theme in many of my books. If anybody tells you that they cannot be creative, it is not true. You can, through various methods and techniques, be outstandingly creative in pretty much any field. The other one that strikes me there is the future's too chaotic, 28%. I'm relatively pleased that that isn't drastically high, because it hasn't been any fun, really, experiencing huge quantities of people in some form of panic, powerless mode. And I'm hoping it was just a short-term aberration. People do have a choice and can do things on their own terms. So we don't want a backdrop where everybody thinks that they're essentially helpless, because it doesn't get you anywhere. Those are my thoughts on that.
I'm trying not to just repeat what Kevin said, but no, I also agree. And again, I think we probably come at this point similarly about creativity. Creativity is really just seeing things differently. And I think I lectured at a couple of universities with students, and you see that they really, really want to be different. They really want to make their mark. They want to do something. They want to go into marketing or fashion or advertising and make a statement. And I think one of the things that's probably a sort of something that's connecting what we're saying and bubbling under is maybe what we need to do, for example, with the younger generation, with people in school, in primary school and secondary school and beyond, is really give them permission to be creative. I mean, I do worry sometimes that school curriculums, and again, I'm talking mainly about Britain. I suspect it's probably less conventional in the Scandinavian countries, but there's a tendency to bleed all the originality and creativity out of young people, so that by the time they're sort of getting to sort of thinking about a career or they're studying, sometimes that word creativity can be looked on rather sort of patronizingly and condescendingly. And I think anything that we can do, people like Kevin, myself, and anyone else in this field, to encourage people to see themselves as being able to come up with new ideas, to create, to see things differently, has got to be a good thing. So I'm hoping that everyone who's listening to this webinar, watching it, feels the same, and that's why you're here.
Yes, and I think it's Dexter Gordon, the jazz musician. He said you can improvise on anything, but you can't improvise on nothing. You have to have a riff. You have to have a starting point, and you don't have to know what's happening out there. You don't have to decide everything in advance. You can see Amazon. They started as an online bookseller, and today they're making their money from lending computer power to companies, to offering artificial intelligence as a service. They've completely changed over 20 years. And now they're trying to reach the moon with their blue sky space company. So they're constantly looking for new opportunities, going away from whatever they're doing if they see new opportunities. They are improvising, and in the process, you can't go wrong, because there is no definite answer.
There's another nice quote, sorry, a musical quote for you, Nils. Miles Davis. He said, "It's not the notes that you play, it's the notes that you don't play." And so there's a quality component to innovation as well.
Can I just say, there's only two things in the world I violently dislike. One is coffee and one is jazz. So, that might be a bit of an issue. Yeah, I was just going to say one other thing, which I sort of didn't quite get in my last rant, which is I'm a big fan of like convergence, of breaking down silos and compartments. And again, I think that's the enemy. I mean, I'm just looking at the conversation about creativity as an art, innovation as an idea. Comfortable is the enemy of creativity. All I think I would say in that sort of sphere is I do worry, looking at some companies, that they've established these departments, compartments and silos. And again, having worked with marketing departments, sales departments, R&D departments, there's still, I think, a tendency to sort of to put people into those compartments and not allow a really sort of creative, fluid exchange. So I've got various ideas and techniques that I use, and I'm sure Kevin does, as a way of just sort of getting people to sort of break out of their individual teams. And again, I do think that is a bit of a sort of institutional barrier in a lot of companies. And often it comes from the top. So I think anything we can do, again, just to allow people to be specialists, but as Kevin and I were saying in the conversation here, generalists are the most creative people. Generalists are going to be the people that really innovate. So I think we need to get that mixture, but we need to give them techniques that allows everyone, I think it's called cognitive diversity, that we allow people to have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different interests, so that we also don't just end up with groupthink, which is, again, the enemy of creativity. End of rant.
Kevin?
Sorry, my views. Actually, I mentioned the sidebar. There was a nice book last year by David Epstein. Actually, countermanded. Gladwell said about 10,000 hours of practice making someone a specialist and being top at what they do. Because actually, when you've got range, you have a reasonable working knowledge and broad interest in a huge range of topics. And it's that range that allows you to look from one to the other, thinking, I want to be applied to that over there in a completely different context. And that leads to fantastic innovative, narrow specialist. And so I'm a great fan of meandering generalists who can link those thoughts together.
Yeah, I think we had a connection problem here. Yeah, it's when you say that, I think of the Disney model, where they have 3 rooms, where one room is for the dreamers, and then you go in there, have great dreams, great plans, and then you take it to the planning room. And in the planning room, you make plans, and all the experts, all the professionals, they can do their stuff so that you get a good plan. And then you take it to the critics room, and everybody who says it can't be done have their go now. But it's not their go at the dream. It's they go on the planning and say, do the plans work? So it's not about criticizing the creativity, but it's criticizing the planning. Okay.
Can I just answer? There's a comment by Rasmus.
Yeah.
Is there a risk of having too little compartmentalization? My experience is that that's very rare. It's much more the other end of the spectrum of having too much compartmentalization. Yes, there's a risk. But as we've been saying, for me, it's about having that sort of cognitive diversity. It's about having a range of different experiences, opinions. I'm a great believer, and I've written about it in the books and stuff, about I'm a classicist by trade, right? I'm a absolutely hardcore arts person, but I've, like many people, got very fascinated by science over the last sort of 20 years, and I've tried to sort of plug that gap. So for me, one of the things we need to do in any sort of innovation, creativity setting is to try, again, balance the art and the science. And my feeling is, and I don't want to maybe necessarily set a big hair running here, but I often wonder whether we've let the sort of science, particularly the sort of hard physics science end of things, take over too much of marketing and innovation, rather than softer biology, psychology type of science, which is probably more conducive to the sort of innovation we're talking about. I use the word arithmocracy. We've become obsessed with numbers and metrics and measurements and KPIs. And I fully understand that. And I realize I'm like Canute trying to push that wave back. But I do wonder, particularly in innovation, whether sometimes the obsession with measurement and control and metrics also becomes the enemy of creativity. Anyone wants to throw vegetables at me now, you can.
I'm slightly conscious about the time here, and maybe if you wants to go on. And that was my word, having you three guys in the room here, that the time may run off. We have a few questions. Would you have a moment time to maybe look at one or two of those, please? Nils, is that all right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So the first one I can take here is from Mike. Mike here asks, I supply shops. They're likely to be changing their ways of working. How should I change mine to reflect this? I import ergonomic chairs and equipment that need to be explained and often tried out before purchase is made. Something that used to happen in a showroom or by sales teams in a customer's workplace.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that one. It's a bit hard not knowing the exact context, but I'm going to take it as read that it is possible for potential purchasers still to visit your showroom in some form. And if you're selling ergonomic chairs, I guess that they're pretty pricey and they're very bespoke and designery, in which case it sounds premium to me. And if it's premium, then I don't see any reason why you shouldn't take some post-COVID circumstances and weave them into the purchasing experience. So, for example, if people are on hand to desanitize and guide people through the entire process, you could be providing an educational function, which would all be part of the service that you're providing when you sell the chair. If you can't do that physically, you may care to do that in a video or online fashion so that the care that you're taking to sell these products is intrinsically woven into them in the minds of your customers.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other, Nils, Taz?
Yeah, I just replied to Christina's comment as well. I think telling stories, again, whether it's visual, whether it's verbal, make the experience, I think, across not just talking about that particular question, but the retail environment. I think enriching, how do we go back to enriching the retail experience, knowing that there's all these issues of hygiene and safety and distance. So for me, whether it's, again, the online and the offline world, whether it's about people telling stories. I mean, again, I think that's something we should definitely go back to, which is making people who are selling in store, not just salespeople, but actual storytellers. And again, I think the whole history, particularly of Scandinavian design and furniture, is some extraordinary, rich stories. And for me, that's something I think that can create that, or renovate perhaps, or renew that sense of desire. So yes.
Thank you. We have another question here from Eirik. Kevin, how would you build planning into the project process so that planning will not become a bottleneck in the process?
Fantastic, thank you. Well,
good question.
First of all, process is quite a boring word, and it usually suggests that something is going to take a rather long time and be quite ponderous. I don't necessarily agree that a process has to be lengthy. And if you imagine a bottleneck, then it means that too much stuff has gone on for too long and now it's ground to a halt or come to a blockage. If that's the case, then you should be able to anticipate the pattern of that long before the bottleneck arrives. which is why some of the mantras that I was suggesting at the beginning include speed doesn't kill, don't lose your momentum. If plan A doesn't work, get on to plan B, move fast, move fast. You know, it's much, much better. And honestly, we don't really want to find that there's a bottleneck suddenly arrived. If it does, you've got to blow everything up and think again, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Nils, here on a closing remark, I'm afraid we are running out of time now. Do you have a few words and maybe summing up some of the observations here now?
Yes, I read about an anthropologist called Mary Douglas, and she wanted to know what is dirt. And she did a lot of research and came up with the answer: dirt is matter out of place. It's nice red wine in the glass, but it's dirt when it gets on your white shirt. And very often, when we innovate, we come up with dirt. It's something matter out of place. We have established this civilization, and every time we introduce something new, there's an immunity system pushing it away. And I think we have to work harder to accept this change, and it starts at the top of companies, and we have to open. And I believe it's because we have to learn that it's exciting to create and to innovate. It's actually the purpose in life to create new stuff and not copy what has already been done. And I think that's a culture that most businesses have to introduce and adopt.
Perfect. With that, we are pretty much coming to the end here. A few last-minute comments from me. Firstly, thank you very much to our strong panel of experts here today. Kevin, Taz, and not least Nils as well, for a very good moderation here as well. We could easily have continued for a wee while longer, I believe. I'm going to be sharing this slide with you all as well. These three gentlemen have all books out on Lit Publishing, and I'm pleased to say that all the members of the Finnish British Chamber of Commerce and the Danish-UK Association get a 20% discount if you go on to this website to purchase your book. And if you don't have the discount code, do get in touch with us and we can share that with you. With that, I really like to thank you all for a great afternoon in good company here with three gentlemen. We do have an oncoming event that is slightly related to this that you may want to consider now already. On the 24th of June, we are looking at integrating social impact into core business activities. So about social innovation approach that can help leaders to find innovation and commercially viable solution during challenging times, like now, for example. 24th of June, and again, a joint collaboration by the Finnish and the Danish together on our respective websites. You can sign up. With that, thank you very much all. Thank you again, gentlemen, for being part of this, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, and thank you.
Cheers. Speak to you soon.
Interesting.
Hang on, I'm